The Hebrew Bible reading for today is from the prophet Isaiah. While these words were spoken thousands of years ago, how might they ring true in today's world? Our reading is from Isaiah chapter 35. Say to those who are of fearful heart, be strong, do not fear. Here is your God. He will come with vengeance, with terrible recompense. He will come and save you. Then the eyes of the blind shall be opened, and the ears of the deaf unstopped. And the lame shall leap like a deer, and the tongue of the speechless sing for joy. For water shall break forth in the wilderness, and streams in the desert, and burning sand shall become a pool, and the thirsty ground springs of water. The gospel reading for this Sunday is a lesson from the book of Mark. In two distinct scenes, we see and hear the work of Jesus. Our reading is from Mark 7. The Syrophoenician woman's faith, verses 24 through 30. From there he set out and went away to the region of Tyre. He entered a house and did not want anyone to know he was there. Yet he could not escape notice. But a woman whose little daughter had an unclean spirit immediately heard about him, and she came and bowed down at his feet. Now the woman was a Gentile of Syrophoenician origin. She begged him to cast the demon out of her daughter. He said to her, let the children be fed first, for it is not fair to take the children's food and throw it to the dogs. But she answered him, sir, even the dogs under the table eat the children's crumbs. Then he said to her, for saying that you may go, the demon has left your daughter. So she went home and found the child lying on the bed, and the demon gone. The next reading tells us how Jesus cures a deaf man, verses 31 through 37. Then Jesus returned from the region of Tyre and went by way of Sidon towards the Sea of Galilee in the region of the Decapolis. They brought to him a deaf man who had an impediment in his speech, and they begged him to lay his hand on him. He took him aside in private, away from the crowd, and put his fingers into his ears, and he spat and touched his tongue. Then looking up to heaven, he sighed and said to him, Ephphatha, that is, be opened. And immediately his ears were opened, his tongue was released, and he spoke plainly. Then Jesus ordered them to tell no one, but the more he ordered them, the more zealously they proclaimed it. They were astounded beyond measure, saying, he has done everything well. He even makes the deaf to hear and the mute to speak.
With the sun streaming in through these windows, it's hard to imagine the change of season that is upon us. That the nights are going to get cooler, that the days are going to get shorter, that the crisp air of fall is coming to be with us. It's a new season. We celebrate it in our United States with the beginning of the school year. That's when we turn a proverbial calendar page and reorient ourselves to the next thing that's going to happen. We do it in the life of the church. This is our new program year. In fact, we're having a big party next week to gather us all together, to feed us and to remind us and to bring us back to be the community for another season of this life of faith together. And there's lots of other things happening in our culture. There's an election coming up, and so there's energy around that. There's a football season kicking off this afternoon. Did anybody know that? There's football this afternoon. Thank you. New things are among us. New opportunities are before us. And new challenges that might invite us to open ourselves in new ways that we haven't experienced before. The readings that I selected this morning are from the Revised Common Lectionary. That's not a tool for scripture lessons that we use very often at Colonial. But when I looked at the texts that were assigned for this day, I was immediately drawn to the story of the Syrophoenician woman. Here is this person. She is not uncommon in the New Testament Gospels because she doesn't have a name. She doesn't have any power. She doesn't have a societal role of status or importance. She's not even Jewish. She's a Gentile, pagan, foreign, statusless woman who has an encounter with Jesus. Now, within the gospel stories, all in Matthew and Mark and Luke and even in John, that should send up a red flag for you. Because it's not often that Jesus has an encounter with a woman when something profound doesn't happen. Do you remember the story about a woman he met at a well in Samaria? How she became an evangelist for the gospel of Jesus Christ? The women who appear in the Gospels are usually a sign. And remember that when the Gospels were written down, they were already a set of stories and faith traditions that a particular community of faith had been sharing with one another over several generations. And so when Mark, or one who is attributed to be Mark, set out to write down this gospel story, he was writing to a specific community. We also learned from our New Testament studies and scholars that the Gospel of Mark was probably the first one that was written because its language is the simplest. The narrative arc is not as well developed as it is in Matthew and Luke. And it certainly does not have the poetic and metaphorical language that we find in the Gospel of John. Mark is the bare bones essentials. For you, my community of faith, in this year, in this time, I must set forth the story of Jesus, born of Nazareth, died on a cross, resurrected in grace. Now, what's interesting about the Gospel of Mark is there are a couple of literary things that emerge throughout the stories that are told. One of them is this secretiveness, this mystery about who Jesus is. And much like in the other Gospels, there is a group of disciples whom Jesus has called and has commissioned for work. But it's funny how they're always put forth as not really giving it. They experience a miracle, but they don't understand. They see 5,000 people being fed, and yet they question what's happened. They see Jesus walking on the water, but how could this be? The disciples, the ones who are called and are the closest followers, do not understand what is happening. And there's another literary theme going on. When something new occurs in the Gospel of Mark, there's usually a reminder that we're not supposed to tell anybody. And that comes up in our story. So before we get to our friend from Syrophoenicia, I want you to consider, are we looking at just an isolated set of stories, the healing of a woman's daughter, the healing of a man, and what those two stories might tell us about our lives of faith? Or are we caught in a larger story arc, a trajectory narrative within the larger work of the Gospel of Mark? Consider this. In chapter 6, Jesus is teaching in Nazareth, and there's a rather heated scene where someone says, "Can anything good really come out of Nazareth?" And Jesus says something like, well, prophets are never welcomed in their own town. And so he's not really being received warmly from his own people, from his family system, from his own religious culture. He's called the 12. They've learned of the death of John the Baptist. They've been out into the wilderness, and this miraculous feeding of the 5,000 has happened. And all of this is happening in that area where Jesus was born and raised. Home turf, if you will, a Jewish region. But in chapter 7, right before we meet our new friend, there's a conflict scene. And as often happens in the Gospels, it's with the religious authorities of the day. And some of the Pharisees come forth and they publicly challenge Jesus, and they get into this debate with him. And they say, oh, your followers, they're eating with unclean hands. Do you not know? How do you not know how that conflicts argues with them. And he says, how do you not understand that nothing that God has made is considered unclean? There are no unclean foods. And it's a moment of tension. Turn the page, and we're told that Jesus decides he needs to take a break and get away for a few days. We understand that. We set aside time in our own schedules, in our own lives to recharge, to rest, to renew. And so he travels. He travels up by Tyre and Sidon. Now, I'll confess, my geography of the ancient Near East is poor. I don't know where Tyre and Sidon are. I rely on biblical scholars to tell me that they were a couple of towns that were up on the north side of the Sea of Galilee. Jesus, all right, I gotta turn my map around so you see it the way it's done. Here's the Sea of Galilee, and this is the Jewish region over here. And so Jesus is taking a trip up north towards Tyre and Sidon. Okay, that tells us something about the map, but it doesn't tell us about the people who live in Tyre and Sidon. Those are Greek communities. Those are Gentile communities. Those are considered to be pagan communities, not Jesus' home turf. So if he's going to get away from it all, he really gets away. And he finds himself in a house, and he gets confronted by a woman. And all we're told about her was that she was Syrophoenician. She was a foreigner. That's our code language. She was one of these pagans of the region. That if we dig a little deeper into her very identity, maybe the key is lying beneath the surface. Because she's not identified as a woman who was the husband of some great figure in the town. She's not identified as the daughter of the great religious leader of the community. She's introduced individually without a male to give her status. Because in the ancient world, that's the only way a woman has status. I could never be who I am unless my husband brought me into a situation. Women had no authority, no societal role, no status, no power. And in the gospel tradition, they usually don't have names. So who comes at night to find Jesus? A woman. A woman who is so concerned for her daughter that she is willing to break all social customs. She is willing to lower herself to come before this man that she's heard stories about. If she's not a believer of the Jewish faith and tradition, what faith would she have in this country healer who people have been talking about in the neighborhood? Is it faith that compels her to come at night? Or is it the desire to save her child that brings her forth? And she enters the house and she kneels. That's important. Because in the previous gospel stories, one who is coming for healing kneels before Jesus. And she kneels and she says, please heal my daughter. Now, in the sunny, shiny, happy Christianity of my Sunday school years, and of my youth group years, and the nicer days of my adult faith experience, I expect a kind Jesus to respond. I expect, you have shown faith. Your daughter will be made well. I expect, take me to her. Let me come to this sick child and let me heal her. I expect a gentle, loving response. But that's not what we get. Not here in the middle of the Gospel of Luke. Jesus says to her, let the children be fed first, for it is not fair to take the children's food and throw it to the dogs. Excuse me? Biblical scholars have wrestled with this scene for decades. Some of them try to soften the moment by saying, well, it's just a way of speech. Perhaps it's more like dog meaning a pet. Maybe it's more just like a gentle pat on the head, dog. And then there are other scholars who say, don't be naive. Jesus is saying you are not part of what is being offered here. You are not part of the Jewish people. You are not part of the chosen ones. You are not part of this revelation that God has brought forth. If I were in that moment, kneeling at the feet of what I expected to be my kind, loving, soft-hearted Jesus, I probably would have just crawled away, crept out of the room, hoping no one saw me and no one heard me. But not this woman. She responds, "Sir," also translated as Lord. Do not the dogs eat the crumbs of the children's food that have fallen under the table? Now we have a theological conundrum. Now there's a gap. Why didn't the author tell us what Jesus was thinking? Why didn't the author tell us what Jesus was feeling? What changed in that moment? The theological conundrum is, if we say that Jesus had an awakening, Greek word, a metanoia, English word, a turning, bigger word, a conversion. If we say that Jesus had a conversion moment, does that mean Jesus wasn't perfect? That's where my Sunday school Jesus and my kind, soft-hearted Jesus comes into conflict with this image of Jesus. Does that mean Jesus in his full humanity was not all that God had intended him to be all along? That Jesus had some growing and some stretching and some opening up to do too? Is that what this story is telling us? Does that bring us into conflict with our Christian creedal traditions that tell us fully divine, fully human, never apart? Does that mean that Jesus' imperfection feels a little bit like mine? So whatever happened in that moment, Jesus says, "For what you have said, you may go. Your daughter is here." Something was opened. Something was changed. Now remember the context of that story. There's the big debate with the Pharisees. There is nothing that is unclean. Everything is part of God's created order, including the pagan Gentiles of Tyre and Sidon. But yes, that's what that means. But the story doesn't end. The text takes us on to the next town in Jesus' journey, where a group of people bring one of their friends forward, a man with a physical disability, a man without a name, a man who is not Jewish, a man who has no status, no power, no wealth, no nothing. A physical disability means he was on the very edge of society. He was separated from community. His friends bring him forth and ask Jesus to heal him. And then I see the Jesus that I prefer. Jesus takes him aside. And it gets very earthy, kind of like in the Gospel of John, Jesus spits in the dirt. There's spitting on fingers, and there's fingers and ears, and his ears are opened up. But he's transformed. The man who formerly was deaf and was mute suddenly could hear and could speak and proclaim that he had had a touch from the healing that Jesus had transformed him, that he had been opened up to a new way of living and a new way of life. The stories of Mark continue. Remember that big arc where we started on the Jewish side of the Sea of Galilee and 5,000 people were fed? There's an argument, and then Jesus goes north. You know what happens next? Jesus comes down the other side of the Sea of Galilee, the Greek pagan side of the Sea of Galilee. Guess what happens? There's a miraculous feeding story. 4,000 people in the wilderness. There's not enough food to feed them. But somebody brings forth loaves and fishes, and suddenly they all, Gentile, Jews, slaves, free, men, women, they all are fed. The ark is taking us geographically through the region. The ark is taking us into a new opening of who God's message is intended for. Is it only for some, or is it for all? So I ask you, as we gather here on this day, to consider these bigger picture gospel themes. I mean, it's pretty clear, I think, the message is that which God intended through the miracles, the teaching, the healings of Jesus of Nazareth were not intended for one group of people. They were intended for all people. I think it's pretty clear that the ideas that we have about social status, those are all human constructions that we create. We decide who has power. We decide who gets a name. We decide who is of importance and who is of not. But God looks beyond that. And so I invite you to consider how God might be opening you to a new reality. How God might be calling a place like our church to be opened to a new experience. That we might be transformed. That we might hear a new word. That our tongues might be loosed to speak a word of hope to this world. Amen. Our hymn of response reminds us that God's grace, God's love is intended for all people. Our hymn is number 394 in our hymnals. It will